They said Willow Creek had the kind of silence you could hear, not the silence of peace but of time, folding in on itself. Every morning, as the mist rose from the water and settled among the willow branches, a faint creak of wood echoed from the small house by the edge of the forest. That was Eleanor Hartman's house, or Ellie, as people in town used to call her, back when she still came down for groceries and Sundry's church. Now, she rarely went anywhere Ellie had learned to live with the sound of her own heartbeat as her only company. The Hartman house wasn't big, nor pretty by modern standards. The paint had peeled off long ago, revealing gray planks of cedar that had aged like old skin. The porch tilted a little to the right. The wind chime by the door sang out of tune, but inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon soap and pine the way Samuel liked it. Samuel Hartman, her husband, gone 15 years now. He'd built a house himself, with rough hands and patient eyes. Every nail, every beam carried his touch. When he died, Ellie had felt like the walls were grieving too. They creaked more often, sighed louder at night, as if missing him, and in the quietest hours, she sometimes imagined she could hear his boots on the floorboards, not as a ghost, no, more like a memory that refused to fade completely. There was a photo on the mantel, Samuel, grinning, holding a fish nearly as long as his arm. Beside it, a smaller frame, a young man with messy hair, her son David. He had his father's eyes, full of mischief and sunlight. David died at 27, a car crash on a snowy night, the kind that takes everything and leaves no explanation. After that, something inside Ellie simply stopped blooming. Her world shrank to the size of the kitchen window, the one that overlooked the creek and the line of willows leaning over it. Every afternoon, she sat there with a cup of Earl Grey, watching leaves drift like slow-moving boats down the water. It wasn't sadness, not anymore. It was a kind of quiet surrender, the kind that comes when you've outlived the noise of your own life. The people in town still remembered her, Mrs. Hartman, the old English teacher. Some said she was strange, talking to herself, talking to ghosts, but those who'd ever sat in her class knew better. They remembered her voice, calm, patient, with that soft way of saying, words are just another kind of touch. And maybe that was why Elle kept talking, to the photo, to the creaking walls, to the memory of her husband walking down the hall. That morning, the first frost had come early. The grass outside shimmered white, and the air smelled of wood smoke and apples. Ellie moved slowly through the house, her joints aching, her slippers whispering against the wooden floor. She filled the kettle, waited for it to hum, and whispered to the photograph on the shelf, "It's cold today, Sam." The creek froze along the edges. "You'd tell me to light the stove early, wouldn't you?" The kettle whistled, sharp and lonely. She poured the water, sat down, and sipped her tea. The cup trembled slightly in her hands. The sound of the clock on the wall filled the room, tick-tick, marking the rhythm of a day that looked almost exactly like the one before. Outside, a gust of wind sent a shower of amber leaves swirling across the porch. The willow branches danced like ghosts with long green hair. Ellie smiled faintly. "It's beautiful, isn't it, Sam?" No one answered, but somehow, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt inhabited. After breakfast, she took her coat from the peg, an old wool thing that smelled faintly of mothballs and rain, and stepped outside. The ground crunched beneath her boots. Across the creek, a pair of deer stood among the birches, watching her quietly, before disappearing into the mist. It reminded her of the years when David was little, chasing frogs and skipping stones by the water. His laughter used to bounce between the trees, wild and free. She could still hear it sometimes. If the wind blew just right, she made her way to the garden, what was left of it. The roses Samuel had planted now grew wild, their petals pale and thin. She crouched beside them, touched one gently, and whispered, "You're still trying, aren't you?" After all these winters, her breath fogged in the air. For a moment, she stayed there, fingers tracing the frozen leaves, eyes half closed. Then she rose, slowly, and turned toward the woods. That's when she noticed a faint trail of footprints leading from the road to the edge of a fence. Big, heavy steps. Fresh. Someone had been there. Ellie hesitated. She wasn't afraid, just surprised. Willow Creek didn't get visitors, not this time of year. The last person to come by was Martha, her niece, back in August, and she always called first. She looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing except the fog. The air was so still that even the crows seemed to hold their breath. Back inside, she locked the door, not out of fear, more out of habit. She poured herself another cup of tea, turned on the radio. Static filled the room. Then an old jazz tune came through, "Autumn Leaves," by Nat King Cole. Samuel used to hum that song when he worked in the shed. She found herself humming along, her voice trembling, thin as the steam from her cup. The falling leaves drift by my window when the song ended. She stared at the radio for a long time, as if expecting it to speak again. It didn't, only the wind answered, rattling the loose pane above the sink. She sighed and reached for her knitting, a scarf she'd been making for no one in particular, maybe for herself, though she already had 3 others. The yarn was a soft shade of blue, the color of the sky before snow. As her fingers moved, her mind drifted to the people she'd lost, the letters she never sent, the Christmas dinners with too much food and too few chairs filled. Somewhere deep down, she wondered if this was how the end comes, not as a sharp break, but as a slow fading of colors, until life becomes a watercolor washed by time. Afternoon turned to dusk. The sky went from gold to gray. Ellie lit the old oil lamp by the window, just as Samuel used to do. "So travelers can see there's still life here," he would say. She smiled at that memory. There hadn't been a traveler in years. Outside, the fog thickened. The sound of the creek faded beneath the wind. She pulled her shawl tighter and whispered to the room. "It's strange, Sam. I feel like something's about to happen." And though she didn't know why, the words left her lips like a prayer. Perhaps it was just the loneliness speaking. Or perhaps, as it sometimes happens in quiet places, the air itself was listening. Because somewhere out there past the bend of the creek, through the cold and the dark, a man and a dog were walking toward her house. And by morning, everything in Ellie Hartman's world, the silence, the stillness, the solitude, would begin to change. By late afternoon, the sky over Willow Creek had turned the color of pewter. The wind was sharp, dry, the kind that warns of snow long before it falls. Ellie could feel the storm coming in her bones. Her knees always told her before the weatherman did. She stood by the window, the light fading to a soft gray. When she saw the first flakes drift across the field, they didn't fall gently. The way they used to, they spun and stung, carried by a restless wind that rattled the loose boards on the porch. She was about to draw the curtains when she heard it, a knock. Not loud, not hurried, just steady, deliberate. 3 times, then silence. For a moment, Ellie thought she might have imagined it. She hadn't had visitors in months. Martha always called before driving out from town, and no one else came this far down Willow Creek Road anymore. She waited, listening. The only sound was the wind pushing against the house. Then it came again, a firmer knock, followed by the low sound of a dog's bark. Ellie's heart gave a small jolt. She set down her teacup and walked slowly to the door. The wood felt cold beneath her palm as she turned the handle. When she opened it, a gust of snow swept in, and with it a man. He stood at the threshold, shoulders dusted white, a travel-worn coat pulled tight around him. His face was weathered, half hidden beneath the brim of a knit cap. Beside him, a large German shepherd sat obediently, its fur damp from the snow, eyes alert but gentle. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," the man said, voice low and rough from the cold. "Didn't mean to startle you. The storm came quicker than I thought. We just need a place to get out of the wind for a bit." Ellie hesitated. She wasn't afraid, just startled by how sudden it all felt. The dog tilted its head, as if sensing her uncertainty. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Michael," he said. Michael Garrison gave a faint, polite smile. "And this is Rex. He's a good boy, I promise." The dog gave a single wag of his tail, then sat down, perfectly still. Ellie studied them for a moment. His boots were caked with mud and ice, his gloves torn at the fingertips. He looked tired, not the kind of tired a good night's sleep could fix, but the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. Something in his eyes, that mix of exhaustion and quiet dignity, reminded her of Samuel when he came home from his long shifts at the mill. She stepped aside. "Well," she said, "no one should be out in this kind of weather. Come in before you both freeze to death." The warmth hit them like a soft wave. Ellie closed the door against the wind and motioned toward the kitchen. "Hang your coat there," she said. "I'll fix something hot." Michael hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he should follow, but the smell of soup, pumpkin, and thyme seemed to answer for him. Rex patted him behind, his nails clicking lightly against the wood floor, nose twitching. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice quieter now. "We won't stay long, just till the storm passes." "Sit," Ellie replied. "That's what the chairs are for." He gave a small laugh, the first sound of warmth between them, and took off his gloves. His hands were rough, scarred along the knuckles. Working hands, or soldiers' hands. She ladled the soup into 2 bowls, set them on the table, and sliced a loaf of bread. The sound of the storm outside was now muffled, like the world had pulled a blanket over itself. The windows glowed soft amber from the oil lamp. "You came far?" she asked as she sat across from him. "From the south," he said between spoonfuls. "Been walking on and off since October. Used to be stationed not far from here. Years back, I thought maybe I could find some work up north." construction, maybe farm work, anything that keeps me busy." She nodded. Listening, he spoke carefully, choosing his words the way people do when they've been alone too long. "I served 20 years," he continued. "Army, been out for a while now. That sometimes feels longer." He smiled faintly. "Guess I'm still trying to figure out what to do with the rest of it." Ellie watched the way he spoke, the pauses, the half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She'd seen that look before, in her students who came home from wars, in the veterans who sat alone at the diner on Memorial Day. "Must be hard," she said softly. Michael shrugged. "Some days better than others." He looked around the small kitchen. "You've got a good home here. Warm. Feels like it's still got life in it." Ellie smiled, though her eyes flicked toward the empty chair across the table. "It used to have more." They ate mostly in silence after that, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, just gentle, like two old souls sharing the same breath. Rex lay at Michael's feet, occasionally lifting his head when Ellie moved. When the bowls were empty, she poured tea Earl Grey, the same she drank every evening. Michael thanked her, both hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. Outside, the snow thickened. The world beyond the window disappeared into white. The radio on the counter murmured a weather report. "Heavy snowfall expected overnight. Travel not advised." Ellie looked out, then back at Michael. "You can't go back out there tonight." He started to protest. "Ma'am, I don't want to impose you're not," she said firmly, that old teacher's tone slipping back into her voice. "I have a spare room. It's cold but dry. You and Rex can stay till morning." Michael's eyes softened. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse out of pride, then nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartman," she said. "Eleanor Hartman. But everyone calls me Ellie." He smiled. "Thank you, Ellie." Rex wagged his tail once, as if seconding the decision. Later that night, as the wind howled through the trees and the house creaked under the weight of snow, Ellie passed the spare room door and saw Michael asleep on the old bed, one arm hanging over the side, Rex curled close by. She stood there for a moment, the lamplight flickering against the hall walls. Something about the scene, man and dog sleeping safely in her home, filled the air with a strange comfort she hadn't felt in years. When she returned to her room, she glanced at Samuel's photo on the nightstand and whispered, "We've got guests tonight." Sam, the kind who still know what loyalty looks like. She turned off the lamp. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside, the house by the creek for the first time in a very long time felt alive again. The morning after the storm, the world outside was silent, the kind of silence that feels holy, like the world itself was catching its breath. Snow lay deep across the yard, smoothing over the rough edges of the old fence, weighing down the willow branches until they bent in quiet reverence. Ellie woke to the soft crackle of the wood stove and the faint, rhythmic sound of a shovel scraping against the porch. Through the frosted window, she saw Michael clearing the steps, his breath a white cloud in the cold air. Rex trotted beside him, tail wagging, occasionally plunging his nose into the snow as if looking for something long lost. For a moment, Ellie simply stood there watching this stranger move with purpose around her home, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of company. When Michael came inside, stamping snow from his boots, she was waiting with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Hope you don't mind chamomile," she said. "Ma'am." He smiled, cupping his hands around the mug. "I've had worse things in the desert." They both laughed. A little awkwardly at first. The house, it seemed, was relearning what laughter sounded like. As the days passed, the routine settled into something gentle and wordless. Michael fixed things, small things at first, then larger ones. The chimney had been blocked by years of soot and bird nests. He climbed up and cleared it out with the patience of a craftsman. He patched the leaky roof above the porch and tightened the old window frames so the cold wind stopped its nightly whispering. Rex was nearby, had taken a liking to Ellie. He'd sit by the kitchen doorway when she cooked, tails sweeping across the floor, eyes following every move she made. Sometimes he barked when she hummed, almost as if joining in the tune. "You've got yourself a little guardian there," Michael said one afternoon as Ellie fed the dog bits of leftover stew. "Maybe he's guarding you," she replied, smiling softly. "I think he knows you need looking after." Michael chuckled. "You might be right about that." They began to talk more as the snow deepened and the days shortened. It started with simple questions about the weather, about how long Ellie had lived in Willow Creek, but soon the stories began to unfold, like 2 books being opened side by side. Michael told her he'd spent 20 years in the army, most of it in Afghanistan. His voice carried no pride when he said it, just the flat tone of someone stating a fact. "I came back different," he said one night by the fire. "Didn't even realize how much until my wife left. Couldn't blame her." I wasn't really there, not in the way that matters. He stared into the flames, eyes distant. I lost the house not long after, tried a few jobs, none stuck. Then Rex came along, found him at a shelter. Guess we're both strays in our own way. Ellie listened quietly, her hands wrapped around her cup of tea. People break, she said softly, but sometimes broken things fit together better than new ones. Michael looked at her, then really looked, and nodded. You sound like someone who's been there too. Ellie smiled faintly. Maybe I have. Over the following evenings, she shared pieces of her own story. About Samuel, her husband, a kind man with calloused hands, who built the porch they now sat on, board by board, one summer long ago. He wasn't a man of many words, she said, but he could fix anything. Once, during a storm, the roof nearly came off. He stayed up there all night in the rain, hammering boards back in place. Said a house only falls apart if the people inside it stop caring. She paused, her gaze drifting to the picture frame on the mantel. When he passed, I thought the house would crumble with him. Maybe it did. A little. Michael said nothing, only nodded. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing to offer. In the evenings, out to dinner, usually soup and bread, sometimes a bit of stew. They would sit by the radio. The old wooden box crackled to life with faint static. Playing jazz or weather reports from faraway towns, Ellie would hum along to the soft tunes, and Michael would close his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire soak into his bones. The nights were long, but they didn't feel empty anymore. The house seemed to breathe again, floorboards creaking onto life, the stove humming, the kettle sighing on the counter. Even the air felt fuller, threaded with something that might have been peace. One afternoon, as the sun broke through after days of gray, Ellie stepped outside to find Michael splitting logs by the shed. Each swing of the axe landed with precise rhythm, wood cracking neatly in two. She watched for a moment, the crisp air biting her cheeks, and called out, "You're going to wear yourself out." He grinned, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cold. "Feels good to be useful. Then come in for lunch before you start feeling too useful," she teased. He laughed, setting down the axe. Rex bounded after him as he walked back toward the house, and Ellie felt her heart swell at the simple sight of it. A man, a dog, and a house that, for the first time in years, didn't feel so empty. That evening, as the light faded and the first flakes of another snowfall drifted down, Ellie set the plates at the table, not out of politeness, but out of habit. The smell of stew filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the firewood. Michael poured water into their glasses and said, "You know, it's strange. I've been on the road for months, and this," he gestured around, "this feels more like home than any place I've been." Ellie looked at him, her eyes warm and kind. "Maybe home isn't a place," she said softly. "Maybe it's the moment you stop running." Outside, the snow thickened, wrapping the world in quiet. Inside, the two of them ate slowly, content. Rex lay at their feet, sighing in his sleep. For the first time in 15 winters, the little house by the creek was alive again, filled not with echoes of what once was, but with a quiet rhythm of what could still be. By late January, Willow Creek had turned to glass. The trees wore a thin crust of ice, and the snow no longer fell in soft flakes but in fine, hard dust that hissed against the windows. The little town seemed to hold its breath through winter, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. So when something did, everyone noticed, and now everyone had noticed. It began with a mailman, who delivered Ellie's letters once a week. He had knocked on the door one morning to find Michael carrying a stack of firewood, his face half hidden beneath a wool cap. The next day, people at the general store were already talking. "Did you hear? There's a man living out by the Hartman place. A drifter, they say, came in just before the storm. Could be trouble. You know how old folks can be too trusting." Rumors in Willow Creek traveled faster than snowmolts down the mountain. By the end of the week, everyone from the postmaster to the pastor's wife had a version of the story, each one darker than the last. When Ellie next went into town for flour and tea, she could feel the eyes on her. It wasn't cruel, not yet, but curious in that quiet, cautious way small towns tend to be. Mrs. Loring from the bakery leaned closer than usual, lowering her voice. "Eleanor dear, I heard you've got company these days." Ellie smiled as she handed over her coins. "Just someone passing through. He's been helping with repairs." Miss Loring's expression tightened, sweet but wary. "Well, I suppose it's good to have a helping hand. Still, one can never be too careful. You know, the world's different now." "The world," Ellie said softly, "has always been different." She picked up her bag of flour and walked out into the cold. 2 days later, her niece Martha arrived. Ellie hadn't seen her in nearly 6 months, a kind-hearted woman in her 40s who ran a flower shop in Montpelier. She showed up unannounced, her car tires crunching the frozen gravel of the driveway. When Ellie opened the door, Martha rushed in, stamping the snow from her boots. "Aunt Ellie," she began, brushing off her coat. "You should have called me." "For what?" Ellie asked, amused. "To tell me you've taken in a stranger." "Oh, that." Ellie poured tea as if she were discussing the weather. "He's not a stranger anymore," Martha said, sitting at the kitchen table. "Aunt Ellie, you live out here alone. You're nearly 80. You don't know this man. What if he's kind?" Ellie interrupted gently. "What if he's simply tired?" Martha frowned. "I'm serious. People are talking. You know how Willow Creek gets." Ellie stirred her tea, her hand trembling slightly from age but steady in resolve. "Let them talk. I've been the subject of gossip in this town since I wore red shoes to church in 1965. I survived it then. I'll survive it now." Martha softened, reaching for her aunt's hand. "I just don't want you to get hurt," Ellie smiled, a line of tenderness in her eyes. "My dear, at my age, the only thing I fear is dying before I've trusted someone again." That evening, when Martha met Michael for the first time, the air in the room changed, polite but cautious. He stood in the doorway, tall and quiet, with Rex sitting at his heel like a shadow. "Martha, this is Michael," Ellie said. "Michael, my niece." He offered his hand. "Ma'am." Martha shook it, but said little. Over dinner, she asked questions that sounded like small talk but weren't. Where was he from? How long had he been traveling? What did he plan to do next? Michael answered calmly, never defensive. He had learned, over years of silence, that truth didn't always need to be defended, it just needed to be spoken once. Clearly, after supper, when Ellie walked Martha to her car, the younger woman pulled her coat tight against the cold. "He seems polite," she said carefully, "but I can't shake the feeling that something's off." Ellie's breath misted in the air. "What's off?" she said. "Is a world that teaches us to fear kindness." Martha opened her mouth to argue but stopped. There was no winning with her aunt once she'd made up her mind. She hugged her tightly. "Please, just lock your doors at night." "I always do," Ellie said, though they both knew she didn't. When the car disappeared down the road, Michael stepped out from the porch. "Didn't mean to cause trouble," he said quietly. Ellie looked up at him, her expression calm. "You didn't. People just like to fill silence with stories." He nodded, gazing out toward the creek where the moonlight silvered the ice. "Still, maybe I should move on soon." "Don't," she said, firm enough to surprise even herself. "You've got work to finish?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes, ma'am." The next morning, they began clearing the garden. It had been years since Ellie had touched it. The once bright roses that Samuel planted, now just thorny stems buried under frost. Michael shoveled away the snow, and Ellie followed behind, pruning what little life remained. Rex bounded through the drifts, barking at the wind. Samuel loved these roses, Ellie said softly. Said they reminded him of Brazilian's beauty that knows how to survive a harsh season. Michael knelt beside the bushes, his gloved hands working carefully. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said, smiling at the memory. "He believed that everything, even something broken, deserves a chance to bloom again." They worked until sunset, their breaths fogging in the chill. As the last light fell over the yard, Michael pressed a rose cutting into the soil and covered it with his hands. "There," he murmured, "new roots for an old soul." Ellie's eyes glistened. "Maybe for both of us." In town, the rumors didn't fade, but inside the little house by the creek, they carried no weight. The kettle still whistled at 40 o'clock, the radio still played old jazz, and each day, the roses stood a little taller beneath the melting snow. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Michael looked up from sharpening an old tool and said, "You ever regret staying here all these years? Alone?" "I mean," Ellie thought for a long time before answering. "No," she said finally. "This house, it remembers who we were. It holds the echoes. And I suppose I stayed because I was waiting not for anyone in particular, just for something to begin again." He nodded slowly. "Maybe we both were." The fire popped outside. A wind swept through the bare trees, carrying faint laughter from the town beyond, distant, harmless, fading quickly into the night. In that quiet, the two of them sat, not as a widow and a wanderer, but simply as two souls who had chosen, however briefly, to stop running. And under the frozen soil of Willow Creek, a few stubborn rose roots dreamed of spring. The storm came quietly at first, just a soft sigh through the trees, a shimmer of white drifting past the window, but by midnight, Willow Creek had vanished beneath it. Snow whirled through the dark like torn pages of a forgotten story, and the wind hummed through the eaves of the old house like a warning no one could quite hear. Ellie woke to that sound, a hollow moan through the chimney, a whistle through the cracks of the window pane. For a moment she thought she dreamed it, that the storm was only a trick of her aging mind. But when she reached for her slippers and looked out into the night, she saw the truth. The fire had gone out. The lamp in the kitchen was still burning faintly, but the chair by the stove, the one where Michael usually sat, mending tools or reading the local paper, was empty. "Michael," she called softly. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. No answer. She checked the hallway, the small guest room, even the porch. Nothing. Only the wind, only the snow pressing its weight against the door. And then she saw the envelope, resting neatly on the kitchen table, just beside her teacup from the night before. Her name was written in a careful, uneven hand. Ellie, her heart sank even before she opened it. The paper trembled in her hands as she unfolded it. "Dear Mrs. Hartman, thank you for giving me a home, even if only for a little while. You didn't ask who I was or what I'd done. You just opened the door and let me be human again. That's more kindness than I deserved. I can't stay, not because I want to leave, but because I don't want to cause you trouble. There are things in my past I've never been able to bury, no matter how deep the snow falls. Years ago, during my time overseas, there was an accident. I was responsible for a convoy near Kandahar. A wrong call in the fog, and a man under my command didn't make it home. The investigation cleared me, but that never cleared my conscience. His name was Carter. He had a wife and a baby on the way. I've carried that with me ever since. Since then I've been drifting, trying to outrun the noise inside my own head. I thought maybe here, in this quiet place, it might stop, and for a while, it did. You and Rex gave me that peace, but I can't let it be taken from you because of me. Please take care of him. He's a good dog, better company than I ever was." Ellie read the letter 3 times before setting it down. Her breath came out in soft, white clouds. She turned toward the window, the storm howling now, the world outside, a blur of white and gray. She could see footprints on the porch, faint and already fading, swallowed by snow. "Foolish man," she whispered, "you can't outrun ghosts." She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stood for a long time by the glass, watching those prints disappear. Each step vanished, as if the night were erasing him from existence, one mark at a time. Behind her the house seemed emptier than it ever had before. The air held that strange stillness that comes after someone leaves a silence too heavy for one person to bear. Then came the sound, a low whine, faint at first, then clearer from outside the door. Ellie turned, her heart quickening. She opened it slowly against the wind, and there he was, Rex. The big German shepherd sat in the snow, his fur dusted white, eyes fixed on her with something that looked like confusion and sorrow. "Rex," she said softly, "where's Michael?" The dog lowered his head, tail still, a faint whimper breaking the air. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, kneeling down despite the biting cold. "He left you too." Rex leaned into her touch, pressing his nose into her palm. His body trembled, not from the cold but from something deeper, the ache of being left behind. Ellie felt her throat tighten. She looked out again, into the white void of the night. The footprints leading away from the porch had vanished completely now. There was nothing left but snow. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on Rex's head, before whispering, "Come inside, boy." Back in the kitchen, she stoked the fire, letting the warmth creep back into the room. Rex curled beside the hearth, watching her with quiet eyes that seemed to understand too much. Ellie sat at the table, the letters still in front of her. The ink had bled slightly where a snowflake had fallen onto the page when she'd opened the door. She traced the edges with her finger. "Haunted men," she said aloud, half to herself. "The world makes so many of them." Her gaze drifted to the old photograph on the mantel. Samuel, smiling in his work overalls, standing in the very same garden that now slept under snow. She remembered how, years ago, he too had come home from a war, different but the same, quieter about his pain, but carrying it all the same. "You'd have understood him, Sam," she whispered. "You always understood the broken ones." The hours passed slowly. The storm grew worse. Wind rattled the shutters like an old memory trying to get in. Ellie made a pot of tea but didn't drink it. She sat by the window, her hands folded around the warm cup, eyes following the endless snowfall. Every so often, Rex would lift his head, ears twitching at the sound of the wind, then rest again with a sigh that seemed too human for a dog. At some point, she thought she saw movement at the edge of the forest, a flicker of shadow among the trees. Her heart leaped, but when she blinked it was gone. It might have been Michael, walking deeper into the dark, or maybe it was just the storm playing tricks. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass. "Wherever you are," she said softly, "I hope you find peace." Rex gave a quiet bark, as if answering her. Toward dawn, the storm began to break. The wind eased, and the world softened into a pale gray calm. Ellie finally rose, her back stiff, and draped a blanket over Rex. He stirred but didn't move from his spot by the door, the same place he'd been sitting when she found him, as though he was still waiting. Loyal thing, she murmured. You don't know how to stop loving, do you? She looked down at the letter once more. The last line seemed to shimmer in the weak light. Please take care of him. He's a good dog. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. They rolled down her cheeks and fell soundlessly onto the paper, blending with the ink until the words blurred and became something new, something that felt like forgiveness. Outside, the first birds began to sing, their voices thin but brave against the morning frost. Ellie closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in years, the sound didn't make her feel alone, because somewhere, out there in the white distance, a weary man was still walking, and she had faith that, someday, he would stop running long enough to come home. And until then, she and Rex would wait, together. By the time the snow began to melt, the world outside looked as though nothing had ever happened. The footprints were gone, the road clear again, the roof of the Hartman house dripping steadily into small puddles along the porch. But inside, Ellie still felt the echo of that storm, not in her bones, but in the silence Michael left behind. For weeks, there was no word, no knock at the door, no letter, not even a rumor carried up from town. Only the wind, the creek, and Rex, who still waited every morning by the window, watching the trail where his master had once walked away. Then, one gray afternoon, a police car came crawling up the drive. Two officers stepped out, one young, nervous-looking, the other older, with the kind of steady face that had seen too many winters. They removed their hats before knocking. Mrs. Hartman, the older one, asked when the door opened. Yes, she said, her voice even. Come in, gentlemen. It's cold. They exchanged a glance but followed her in aside, stomping the slush from their boots. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and chamomile tea. Rex lay by the hearth, his ears twitching. The younger officer cleared his throat. We're looking for a man named Michael Garrison. You might have seen him, early 50s, beard, travels with a German shepherd. Ellie poured them tea before answering. I see, she said quietly. And what has he done? The older officer hesitated. He's not wanted for a crime exactly, he said, choosing his words carefully. There was a call from downstate, a missing veteran, possibly unstable. He left a VA shelter without notice. We're just trying to make sure he's safe. Ellie stirred her tea, eyes lowered. Safe, she repeated softly. Yes, ma'am. She looked up then, and the steadiness in her gaze made both men shift a little. You won't find him here. Did you know him? I knew, she said, a man who was tired, a man who split firewood for me and told the truth even when it hurt. If that's your Michael, then yes, I knew him. The younger officer opened his notebook. When did you last see him? Ellie smiled faintly. The night it snowed. Did he say where he was headed? No, but I don't think he's running anymore. The officers exchanged another glance, one of those unspoken conversations made of half-doubt and half-understanding. The older man finally nodded. If you see him again, Mrs. Hartman, please let us know. He could use some help. She nodded. So could we all. When they left, she watched their car roll slowly back down the hill, two dark figures swallowed by the pale light of afternoon. Then she closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, and exhaled, not out of fear, but something heavier, something like relief. That someday Ellie walked to the small white church at the edge of town. The path was slushy, the air sharp with thawing pine. Inside, Pastor Whitmore was straightening hymnals when he saw her. Mrs. Hartman, he said warmly, haven't seen you in a while. How are you holding up? Ellie smiled faintly. I came to talk about someone, she said. A man named Michael Garrison. The pastor nodded, folding his hands. Is he a friend? Yes, she said, though I think he'd be surprised to hear me call him that. And there, in that quiet church with sunlight spilling through the frosted windows, Ellie told his story. Not the version the police might write in a report, but the real one about the snowstorm, and the soup, and the man who split wood and talked little but listened deeply, about a soldier who had carried a name Carter like a stone in his heart for years, and who left not out of guilt, but out of love. When she finished, the pastor sat silently for a long time. Grace, he said finally, that's what you gave him. I didn't give him anything, Ellie replied. I just opened the door. Word spread, as it always does in small towns. But this time, it spread differently. Instead of suspicion, it carried a quiet admiration, the kind that slips between people over coffee counters and grocery aisles. A few folks from the congregation, young ones mostly, the kind who were always looking for purpose, came to Ellie's door one morning. We've been thinking, said one of them, a boy named Travis who worked at the mechanic's shop, about veterans like your friend. There's a lot of them out there, cold and sleeping rough. We figured maybe we could do something, cook meals, build a shelter, something small to start. Ellie felt her chest tighten. In that way, that's half sorrow, half gratitude. That sounds like something Michael would have helped with, she said. Rex boxed softly, tail thumping as if in agreement. Within weeks, the old church basement had been transformed. A long table stood at the center, steaming with pots of soup and coffee urns that never seemed to empty. Coats hung along the wall. There were blankets, candles, and laughter, that rare sound that only comes when strangers stop being strangers. Ellie sat in her usual place by the door, pouring tea for anyone who wanted it. Some of the men who came looked just like Michael, tired eyes, careful words, hands that shook a little when they reached for the cup. She would smile and say, "You're safe here," and every time, she thought, maybe he'll walk through that door one day. By spring, people from nearby towns had heard the story, the old woman from Willow Creek who took in a lost soldier. Local papers wrote about it, soft human interest pieces that called it a lesson in quiet courage. She gave him warmth, one headline read, "And he gave a town its heart back." Ellie didn't think of it that way. To her, it was simpler. She had just done what Samuel would have done. But one afternoon, as she sat by the creek with Rex at her feet, she heard the church bells ring, not for a sermon, but for the first community supper the new volunteers had organized entirely on their own. She smiled, listening to the echoes roll down the valley. Maybe kindness wasn't something you could keep. Maybe it was something you set loose, and it found its way on its own. That night, she brewed herself a cup of chamomile and read Michael's letter again. The paper was worn now, creased at the edges. The ink had faded, but one line still stood clear. "You made me feel human again." She folded it carefully and slipped it back into the drawer beside her husband's photograph. "See, Sam," she whispered, "the house is laughing again." Rex stirred, lifting his head at the sound of her voice. Outside, the last of the snow melted into the creek, carrying away winter's memory. And down in town, under the golden lights of the little church basement, people were serving soup to men who thought the world had forgotten them, men who, for the first time in years, were beginning to believe that maybe it hadn't. By March, the last of the snow had melted from the hills. The air carried that faint, damp sweetness that only comes when winter finally surrenders, when the earth exhales again. Down by the creek, wild crocuses were pushing through the thawed soil. The apple trees, still bare and crooked from years of storms, waited in quiet patience. And every morning, Rex could be found in the same place, sitting beside Samuel Hartman's grave, head bowed, as if keeping watch. He'd grown thinner over the months, his fur touched by gray, but his loyalty had not faded. Ellie would walk down the slope each day with a biscuit and a kind word, brushing his ears, telling him the same thing she'd told him all winter. He loved you, Rex. He really did. Then she'd look toward the distant road that wound down from the town, her heart tugged by a small, unreasonable hope. One morning in April, when the sun was still low and gold, Ellie heard something unusual, the sound of gravel crunching under steady boots. She was sweeping the porch when she saw a figure standing at the gate. The early light caught on his coat, his beard trimmed now, his shoulders straighter. For a moment, she didn't move. Then Rex, who had been lying by the steps, twitched his head, and the sound that came from him was half bark, half cry. He bolted down the path, tail wagging furiously. Ellie's hand trembled on the broom. "Michael," she whispered. He knelt as the dog licked against him, laughing softly, his eyes wet. When he looked up at Ellie, there was something new in his face, not the weary, hunted look of the man she'd last seen disappearing into the storm, but a quiet steadiness. "Morning, Mrs. Hartman," he said, his voice rough but kind. Ellie stepped down from the porch, her breath caught between disbelief and relief. "I thought you were gone for good." "I was," he said. In a way. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. Inside was a letter from the V, stamped and official. "They cleared me," he said. "There was an investigation. Turns out the accident wasn't my fault. Equipment failure. They told me I could come back any time." Ellie read the letter silently, then looked up. "And will you?" He shook his head. "No, I think I've had enough of going back." There was a long pause between them, the kind that needed no words. "Then what will you do now?" she asked. Michael smiled faintly. "I heard your garden could use a little work come spring. Thought maybe I could earn my keep pruning, planting, fixing up the fence." Ellie tilted her head. "You want to work for T&Company?" He chuckled. "In a patch of land where no one looks at me like I'm broken." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, really looked, and felt something in her chest loosen. "Like I'm brought untied." "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I can find a spare pair of gloves by afternoon." The two of them were in the garden. The soil was still cold, but Michael dug with slow, patient strokes. Ellie trimmed the rosebush, humming a tune Samuel used to hum. Rex lay between them, dozing in the sunlight as if peace itself had settled over the yard. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to, but when the sun began to set, painting the hills in shades of honey and lilac, Ellie brought out 2 cups of tea and set them on the porch railing. "Sit," she said. "You've earned it." Michael wiped his hands on his jeans and sat beside her. Steam curled between them, catching the last light. For a while, they just listened, the rustle of early spring wind, the faint trickle of the creek below, the steady breathing of the dog at their feet. Then Michael spoke. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think my life ended over there. After Carter, after the war, after everything. I thought I was just walking out the clock." Ellie sipped her tea, eyes fixed on the horizon, and now, he smiled, small and genuine. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe life isn't about starting over. Maybe it's just about finding one more door that opens when you think they're all closed." Ellie turned to him then, her eyes soft with the kind of understanding that comes only from loss. "I used to think the same," she said, "that my world ended when Samuel passed. The silence in this house nearly swallowed me whole." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then one stormy night, a man with kind eyes and a heavy heart knocked on my door, and the house started breathing again." Michael lowered his head, his throat tight. "You gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost. And you," Ellie said, "reminded me that kindness isn't a thing that fades, it just waits for someone to need it again." They sat in silence after that, letting the words hang in the air until the last of the light disappeared. Over the next weeks, Willow Creek seemed to bloom along with the earth. Michael kept to his word, repairing the fence, mending the shed, planting rows of herbs and vegetables that soon painted the garden in living color. The townsfolk who'd once whispered about the drifter with the dog now waved when they passed. Some even stopped to lend a hand, trading seeds and stories, and every evening, the porch would glow with lamplight, 2 silhouettes against the window, teacups in hand, talking softly into the dusk. Ellie's laughter returned, first light, genuine, surprising even to her. Ben Michael's smile, not the forced one of a man trying to hide his scars, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd finally found home. One evening, as they watched the first fireflies drift over the field, Michael said, "Funny thing, I used to dream of peace like it was some faraway country. Turns out, it was just here waiting at the end of a gravel road." Ellie chuckled. "Most of the good things are." He nodded, glancing toward the stars. "Maybe we don't get to choose what breaks us, but maybe we do get to choose where we heal." She reached over, resting her hand lightly on his. "Then let's call this place what it is," she said. Home. Rex stirred at their feet, sighing contentedly. The creek murmured below. The wind moved gently through the apple trees, and the night settled like a promise around them. And for the first time in a very long time, Ellie Hartman and Michael Garrison both believed in the quiet, unspoken way only the healed can, that some returns are not about going back, they're about finally arriving. It was a quiet morning in late October when Willow Creek lost its oldest heartbeat. The sun had barely risen over the misty hills, and the air carried the faint scent of rain and woods. Inside the little wooden house by the stream, everything was still too still. A kettle sat on the stove, unlit. The clock ticked faintly in the corner, and in her small bedroom, surrounded by faded photographs and pressed flowers, Eleanor Hartman had slipped peacefully into her final sleep. She was 80 years old. Rex was the first to know. The old German shepherd lay beside her bed, his head resting against the quilt. When the light came through the curtains, he didn't move. He only whimpered softly, as if sensing that the warmth beside him had faded into something larger, something eternal. By the time the neighbors came, Martha from the town, the pastor, and 2 others who often brought her groceries, Rex was still there, guarding her like he had always done. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. On the small nightstand rested a folded letter, the edges curled, signed in careful handwriting, "Michael Garrison." They found him the next morning, sitting on the porch steps, staring at the creek. He didn't cry, not in front of anyone, but there was something in his stillness that said everything words couldn't. He'd written that letter the night before, as if he had known what was coming. Inside, the note read, "She taught me that the past can't be erased, but kindness can rewrite it." That single sentence spread quietly through Willow Creek like sunlight through fog. The townsfolk who had once gossiped now spoke her name with reverence. The pastor read the letter aloud at her memorial, his voice trembling. "She gave shelter to a stranger, and in doing so, she reminded us what it means to be human." Martha, her niece, placed a framed photograph on the casket. Ellie and Michael sitting on the porch, teacups in hand, Rex between them. Behind them, the trees glowed gold in the afternoon light. Winter came again, as it always did in Vermont. Michael stayed. He tended to the garden as Ellie once had, pruning the roses Samuel planted, stacking firewood, and keeping the kettle warm for anyone who came by. Rex never left his side. The house didn't feel empty, it felt watchful, as if the walls themselves remembered laughter and gratitude. And by spring, Willow Creek had changed. The small church began hosting weekly suppers for veterans. The idea had been Matthew's, inspired by Ellie's story. The sign outside read, "Hot meals, open hearts." Donations poured in. Young people volunteered. Men who had once slept in their trucks now had warm beds for the night. Someone even built a wooden bench down by the creek where the willows dipped their branches and the air smelled of moss and rain. On it, a brass plaque read, "Kindness never die." It was Michael who carved the letters, his hand steady, his eyes misted, when he fastened it to the bench. He whispered, "You'd like this, Ellie. You always did prefer simple things." Seasons passed. The garden bloomed and withered, and bloomed again. Children began stopping by after school to feed Rex treats and ask Michael for stories. He told them about the lady who loved tea and poetry, who believed that every stranger carried a story worth listening to. He told them about the night he'd knocked on her door, half frozen and half broken, and how that night changed everything. Sometimes, when he finished, he'd smile and say, "She didn't save me, she just reminded me that I was still worth saving." The children would listen wide-eyed, then run off to play among the trees. And in those quiet evenings, Michael would sit on the bench, Rex lying beside him, and he'd watch the sunset paint the water in gold. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The silence between them felt like a conversation with the past, a soft, unending one. Years later, travelers passing through the town began to hear whispers of a place where tea is always free, and no one leaves feeling like a stranger. Truck drivers, hikers, lost souls, they all found their way down that gravel road to the little house by the stream. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation, but all left with the same memory: a warm cup of tea, a quiet man with kind eyes, and a loyal old dog sleeping under the willow tree. And though few knew the whole story, they all felt something when they sat on that wooden bench, as if the air itself carried the echo of two lives that had found peace in one another. One autumn evening, long after most of the town had gone to bed, Michael stood by the creek, watching the leaves fall. The wind rustled the willows, sending a few down into the dark water. They floated for a while, then vanished around the bend. He thought of Ellie, then her laughter, her quiet strength, the way she looked at the world, not for what it was, but for what it could be if only people were gentler with each other. He spoke softly into the night. "You were right, Ellie, it doesn't end. Not really, it just changes shape." Rex barked once. As if in agreement, Ben lay down, resting his muzzle on his paws. The stars shimmered above, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world felt exactly as it should: small, fragile, kind. When people asked about Eleanor Hartman years later, they didn't talk about her age or the way she died. They talked about the stories, about the cups of tea, the man she helped, the dog that never left her side, and the garden that kept blooming no matter how harsh the winter. And when they spoke of Michael Garrison, they said he was the man who stayed. He lived quietly in that house by the creek until his last days, never asking for much, never needing more than the sound of the stream and the shade of the willow. Some evenings, travelers swore they could still hear voices faint, carried by the wind, a man and a woman laughing softly, as if sharing a secret only they could understand. Each autumn, when the leaves turn and the first frost glazes the meadow, a small group of townsfolk gathers at the bench. They bring tea, light a candle, and sit in silence for a while. No one speaks. No one needs to, because in the gentle murmur of the water and the slow fall of the willow leaves, everyone feels the same quiet truth that kindness, once given, never really leaves. It ripples outward, like the creek that runs through Willow Creek, carrying stories farther than anyone can see. And so the story of the woman by the stream ends not in sorrow, but in continuity. In every open door, every warm cup, every act of grace offered to a stranger, the house still stands, weathered but steadfast. The bench still gleams under the willows, and when the wind moves through the trees, it sounds almost like a whisper, gentle, eternal: kindness never dies.